Hello to the curious and welcome to this new tutorial on how to create your very own React Life Advice app. Now this app essentially is fairly basic. It's using React, Typescript and Sass, and we'll be using an API called the Advice Slip API, which is this here. So this is what we'll be using to create it. We'll be using this endpoint, which essentially generates some life advice. I'll blow this up. So yeah, every time you refresh it, you just get some more information. It's got a unique ID. It's a very simple data object, very simple API, and that's what we'll be using. Now this is the app we're going to be building. So you can see it's styled here. So every time we go down here, we can see that we've got the advice. We click refresh and we see a little loading animation and we get some new advice, and that's essentially the app. So we want to be able to fetch the data each time, and we want to do it in a way that doesn't overload asking the API for information, and if we quickly press the button several times, it doesn't try to then override it with a new request and then have all these hanging requests. So there's a lot of clever stuff under the hood we're going to take care of, and it'll be a really good way to learn about promises and learn about working with APIs and things like that. So we'll get started with that in a moment, but the way we're going to build it is using something called Bismuth, which is here. Now Bismuth is a starter template or recipe essentially that I created for Curious Byte. So the idea is that this is a React, Vite and TypeScript starter template. It has Sass as well, and this is what we'll be using for a lot of projects, but especially this one. All we simply need to do is just clone it down. So let's hop into our terminal and actually create the directory that we're going to clone this down into. So we're in our sites folder and we'll make a directory and we'll call it Life Advice, and then we'll cd into Life Advice and we will git clone Bismuth, and we'll make sure to put the dot to denote where we want to put this, and that'll be in the directory we're in, which is Life Advice, and it will clone into that. Awesome. And then what we need to do is actually create this repo and make sure we set the remote URL to this as well, because we don't actually want to push to Bismuth. So if you go to whatever GitHub repo you want and create a new repository, we'll call it Life Advice. So what we need to do is make sure we set the remote origin to the address that we want, of the repo we want. So we need to type in git remote set URL origin, and that should do the trick. Okay, and then we should be good to go. So what we want to do is just make sure we install all our modules. You can use whatever you want, yarn install, npm install. I'll be using pnpm. Brilliant. And then we'll just do pnpm and we'll start the dev server. Now it's got an interesting local host, and there we go. That's Bismuth set up, and that'll be the foundation of our project. And essentially it's the Vite React TypeScript starter package, but with some additions catered toward Curious Byte and some of the projects that we'll be creating. But it's really good for any projects you want to start that require React or TypeScript or any of these technologies. And I'll be doing some in the future with Tailwind and stuff like that. Anyway, let's go open this up in the editor and start editing. Right, so we're met with the README straight away in our project. So we'll just type the app name in, Life Advice app, get some real good life advice. Anyway, close that down. Let's go into our source folder. Let's go into our index file straight away. Let's just update this to Life Advice app. Go to our app, and a lot of this we can get rid of now. So we'll get rid of that, and we'll get rid of that, And what we'll do is we will keep this. We'll keep that class name and we'll put life advice app. Delete that for now, and we'll put advice goes here. Save that. Oh, and get rid of all of these as well. Actually, we do not need all these imports anymore. We'll keep the app.css import. Yeah, that should be fine. Brilliant. And there we go. So that's what we are so far. It says life advice app here. We've got our header changed, and we've got the foundation to get started. So very quickly, we now have our React package, our React project up. So let's head back into app.tsx. So what we want to do is in here, we want to go fetch our data from the API. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to create some kind of fetch handler. So we'll make one now. And within here, we want to actually go use the fetch API to go get it. For those unfamiliar with the fetch API, it's essentially a way of calling endpoints and getting information from them. So for example, a very simple fetch is creating an async function and then getting a response. So we can literally just take this here, go back to our project, and just paste that into there, and we'll put fetch handler. And we need to make sure we get the API URL, which is this here. So that is api.adviceslip.com/advice. And we'll just put data here, or we'll put advice, and then we'll put advice here. And then all we'll do is we will get a use effect. And we will call the fetch handler. Oops. Make sure we import that from React. So we've called the fetch handler. So let's go see if this works. So we'll open up our console. So if we refresh now, we can see we have our API call. So we have our response here. Tell it like it is, 102, and it's the same one. Yeah, there we go. So that is making the call. But we can tidy that up a little bit. So it's not entirely clean. So let's go back and tidy that up. Within the fetch handler, we need to create an abort controller and a signal. And the reason why we need to do that is because we want to improve the performance of this by cancelling the previous request and putting it into a loading state so that it's not constantly sending requests one after another. And basically, if a new request is made whilst the other one is still going, it literally cancels that and focuses on the new one, which will improve performance and speed. That's why we need something like an abort controller. So we pop the signal in there within the fetch request. And then what we want to do is also set an error state. And then what we want to do is we want to integrate more of this into the response. So down here, we'll say if the response, is okay, then we'll throw new error, and we'll say this throws a new error and gives us back the response status. And then after that, we want to return the response. And what we'll say then after that, we'll get the advice. And we're going to add some new state here. So we're going to add some loading state. Set it as a Boolean, and we'll say false for now. And we'll say set loading as false. We also want some data here as well, so we'll say const data set data equals useState. And for this, what we'll need to do is create a new type, and we'll go do that now. So we'll create an advice slip type, which essentially has the shape of the data object, ID and advice. So if we go have a look at the data now, so this is what the API returns. It's an object with slip, ID, which is a number, and then advice, which is a string. So that's essentially what we're returning here. And then we'll grab this type, add it here, and make sure we set the data to advice here. And then the last bit of state, what we want to do is go ahead and add our error state, which is essentially just going to be a string value, and it can be null. So that can be null as well. So I know this looks quite complicated, but what we're saying is we're structuring our response from the API. So we're saying we're going to fetch the API, and this is what we're going to be doing stage by stage. So right now we're setting the loading state, and we're setting the data, which is really important. And what isn't quite clear here is that we're actually going for the response, but this second action here, this second pipe, is how we're actually getting the data back from the API, and then we're doing stuff based off that action of getting the data. And then we'll also just set the error here to null, and then we will also add a catch statement for errors at the very end, and that will just set the error to the actual error message, so we can keep that in here. And then we're setting the data to null here if there's an error. We're not worrying about the data, showing that data yet. And then we're making sure that we're setting the loading to false. Okay, we can get rid of this console log now. And then at the very end of the call, what we want to do is make sure that we're aborting it, that we are stopping the interaction, and we're not going any further with that. Okay, so now we're going ahead and basically doing the response. What would be nice to actually console log, and we can get rid of all of this. It's just the fetch. So what we'll do here is just before this abort control return statement, we'll console log the data very quickly, just to check the response. So we're returning now the state that we've saved in here, and let's go have a look. Oh, right. So we can see now we are getting back our data from our endpoint. So that's amazing. That's exactly what we wanted. Now, because this is an object, it's not an array of any kind, we do have to deconstruct it to be able to actually access the data. So when I say deconstruct, what we'll need to do is essentially say, let's say here's a slip, and we'll say we'll go into data, and we're not sure what that's going to look like. And as we remember, it's a slip here, and because we've added this as a as the type here in the use state as a generic, we actually get really good suggestions on what this should be. So currently we've got the type is slip, so it's saying, oh, slip, so it should then return ID and advice, which is correct if we did it just here. But we want to go one step further and ask for the advice, or return the advice. And then if we have a look here, it's saying it is string, undefined. So the type autocomplete on the IntelliSense here is incredible once you set it up in this way, and you make sure that the response is typed, and it helps with auto-completing and just working around the API a lot easier. So now we've got slip. Let's head all the way down to here and delete this and data bind this. So we'll just put slip here in some curly braces, and there we go. Always get two-siders. So if you refresh that now with a manual refresh, we get a new one. So we can see that this is working with the endpoint, but one issue we do have is if we go back here, we'll get rid of this console log now, we don't need that. is we need a way to refresh it. So what we'll do is just below here, we'll just add a simple button, and we will call the fetch handler here that we've created, and we'll give it a title of refresh the advice. So when you hover over the button, it will just say refresh the advice. We'll give it a type of button, and we'll give it some text that just says refresh. So that should be fine for accessibility and everything, because it will always look for the text first and read that out on the screen reader. So that should be fine. Context is button, should be very straightforward. Okay, so there we go. So you can see Bismuth has some base styling. It's already got some button styling, which is great. And then if we press refresh, that should refresh it for us. Every time we click this, it refreshes. Now sometimes you can see if you click it twice, it kind of hangs a bit, and we can sort that by adding a loading state. Now we added a state to handle the loading, so we can actually just implement that now. Before we do, we'll just add a little bit of styling here. We'll put this onto one line. We'll give it the font size of 30 pixels and a font style italic. Now, because we are adding some styling, normally I would create its own class name, or I would create its own style component, and start to basically pull the styling away from the HTML, because it's starting to get a little complicated. But because this is a demo, we don't essentially need to do this. But if you were to build this app further, I'd probably create its own component. I would start to think of definitely having its own class name. So yeah, I would then change the color here. We'll say just to white. Let's go take a look. That's much better. So we've added some quote marks here. So if we go back, just within here, we've added some quote marks around the slip data binding we did. So now we've got some quote marks, and I think that looks a lot better. That is true. Do not let your mother cut your hair. My mum cut my hair once, and she cut my ear. It actually bled. Traumatized me for life, forever getting a loved one to cut your hair. Actually, we're just going to add a little bit more styling here. So we use inline style to add max width styling. Let's go 40 rem. Now the reason we're adding this is because sometimes this text can get really large. Okay, so what we want to do now is we actually want to wrap this in a fragment. We'll move this div down to here, have this go back, divs on this level, this goes down. So we'll actually leave the header to go as long as it needs to, because really it's only a set size. It's not going to go that far. That's not going to change. What has changed is this. What will change is everything in here. So really we should just only focus on controlling that. And then what we want to do is wrap this in our loading state to look something like this. So essentially we're using the loading state above that we're setting in our fetch function here, our fetch method. So the loading is controlled there. We also have our error, which is also defined here in our state. So it's saying if it's loading, then show this text here, or show this this element, and if it errors, show an error state. And if it is not an error after all of that, then show this. So traditionally you wouldn't really show multiple ternaries like this. You'd probably have like a switch statement, but just for simplicity's sake, for now we'll do it like this. So we can see that this is the logic. Let's go take a look. So we'll go use the refresh button. So we go here, click refresh. Oh, let's reload this first. Click refresh. Interesting. Aha, right. So we weren't seeing anything there for a reason. And that's because this currently is setting loading to false both times. Because essentially that's what it's meant to be doing. But we also need to have the initial point, the first state, to always be loading. So we want the loading to always be true, and we want the error to always be null, and then the error should be changed here to the error message if there is an error. So by default that is the case, and then also by default we want this to be true, or setting it to true, to reset it to be true. And that's what they're doing. I mean, you could have the defaults here, but this is resetting it by actually setting it here at the start to be a certain value. Okay, so let's go back, let's click refresh, and there we go. We can see that it says loading just before the next refresh. Winter is coming. I'm interested. It is coming, technically. And there we go. So we can make that a little bit more interesting, because, you know, as well as it telling us that it's loading, I feel like we can do a bit better. So what I want us to do is create a new spinner component. If we go back here and within the components folder, so we'll delete that and then we'll create a new one. So spinner, let's spell that. I cannot spell apparently. Spinner.tsx. We will create an index.ts, and we will create a SAS modules file. Brilliant. We now have our spinner component. We're not really using React, and it's implicitly used anyway, so we don't really need it. So we have our spinner component. We'll create a spinner class here. Make sure we export default from spinner, and this is just so we have cleaner imports from the folder, so we're not having to import spinner like this. That's why we do this file and this export, and then we'll add our styling and elements. So we're importing style from spinner module, that's our CSS modules, and then we'll add the class name here for spinner, which we've added in here. And our elements are very simple, essentially a div and another div back to back. So essentially two divs like this, and they're just closed. So we have that. So let's go put in some styling for here. And essentially what we're doing is we're styling the initial wrapping div to say that the loader is going to be about 80 centimeters. It'll be an inline element, position relative, because the elements inside are going to be absolute. So it being relative creates a box that contains it, and then the absolute stuff can be all over the place inside it, but it will be contained within these 80 by 80 pixels. We're adding a white border, and we're essentially adding a animation here called ripple. This will essentially do the ripple animation that we want, and we're going to have a slight delay on it, and we're going to have it infinitely going. Right, let's go back to here, and then when we have the text that said loading, we'll insert the spinner component, and that should be imported now. Okay, let's go check this out. So if we click refresh, let's see what happens. We see our ripple loading animation now, which is awesome. So that's exactly what we wanted. Now, that is essentially the life advice app. So what we'll do now is push this up to Git and put this on Vercel. So let's do that now very quickly. Git add all and git commit initial tutorial commit, and then we'll push it up. And that is pushed up. So let's go to here, refresh. Brilliant. Life advice app is up, made for Curious Byte. So let's go to Vercel. I will click add new project. It's searching, import life advice. So it's already picked up that we're using Vite as our preset, which is correct. So we don't really need to do anything else. We can just deploy. So I'm hoping this goes through without too much pain. We probably should have done a TypeScript check before we sent this up, and a neoslint check, but I think this should be fine. Let's go check out the build. Oh, I think it's up. It's deployed. Way, there we go. Here's some confetti. So that's it, guys. Let's visit here. Let's go grab this URL actually. That's a very nice app. That is the Life Advice app using the Advice Slip API. So we've created this in React, Vite, Typescript, Sass, and we've put that all together, fetched this API using promises, and we've got loading state, error states, the button is accessible, and this is mobile friendly as well. And then we've gone ahead and uploaded this to Vercel. So this is a great portfolio item. This is really good to show off to potential employees, or just, you know, for yourself as a personal project to do some learning. That's the Life Advice app. Let's quickly go add this to GitHub. So we'll go here and add this as the URL, and that has been added. So now when we click here, we go straight away to our Life Advice app. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Please do make sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at @thehashton if you enjoyed this, and if you want to know when more tutorials like this are happening. But otherwise, I will catch you in the next one, probably next week. All the best. See you in the next one.